Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Key performance indicators, or KPIs, are metrics that show how well a process or activity is achieving its defined objectives. In other words, KPIs are how organizations measure performance. They are not risk metrics by themselves, but poor performance on a KPI can lead to increased risk. In other words, low performance can become a risk signal. For example, if a KPI shows excessive downtime in a key service, that underperformance may create operational or reputational risk. In other words, inefficiency may generate exposure. KPIs help detect inefficiency, deviation from expectations, or stagnation in mission-critical areas. In other words, they act as an early warning for business operations. They are used to track business health, monitor alignment with resources, and evaluate how performance affects the control environment. In other words, KPIs connect performance to control. CRISC candidates must understand that KPIs are part of the bigger picture. In other words, they complement, not replace, other indicators. On the exam, KPIs often appear alongside key risk indicators and key control indicators. In other words, you'll see them side by side in data scenarios. Strong answers will reflect how each type of metric plays a different but complementary role. In other words, KPIs show how things work, while KRIs show what could go wrong. It is essential to distinguish KPIs from KRIs and KCIs. In other words, know what each metric is telling you. A KPI is a performance measure. It tracks how well a process or service is performing. In other words, it evaluates operational effectiveness. Examples include service uptime, customer satisfaction scores, or average resolution time. In other words, they track output and quality. KCI, or key risk indicator, signals a condition that could increase exposure, such as failed logins, policy exceptions, or unusual activity. In other words, KRIs are leading indicators of future risk. A KCI, or key control indicator, tracks whether controls are being executed effectively, like the percentage of completed access reviews. In other words, KCIs show how well safeguards are working. In summary, KPIs measure process output, KRIs track risk, and KCIs track control health. In other words, each metric serves a different monitoring purpose. On the CRISC exam, you may be asked which metric to use. In other words, you'll need to match the question with the right type of insight. If the question focuses on business efficiency or process quality, it's usually pointing to a KPI. In other words, use KPIs when the topic is about how well something works. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Good KPIs have several shared characteristics. In other words, not every number is useful. They must align with business objectives, meaning the thing they measure must matter to overall goals. In other words, don't track metrics that don't affect outcomes. They must be clearly defined and consistently measured across systems and teams. In other words, the data must be reliable and standardized. They must be actionable. When a KPI changes, it should prompt someone to investigate or act. In other words, metrics must trigger decisions. KPIs must also be easy to interpret. Confusing or overly technical metrics lose their value. In other words, readability supports usefulness. They must be tied to a specific performance target. Otherwise, there's no way to tell if the metric is acceptable or not. In other words, benchmarks turn data into insight. And finally, they must be tailored to the specific process or team. In other words, don't apply the same KPI everywhere. On the CRISC exam, strong answers will include one or more of these attributes to demonstrate KPI quality. In other words, good metrics meet both business and operational criteria. There are many examples of KPIs that apply directly to risk contexts. In other words, performance data often has indirect risk relevance. One is the percentage of service level agreements met over time. In other words, it shows whether promised services are delivered. Another is the average time it takes to respond to an incident or alert. In other words, response time affects containment. A third is the cost of responding to or resolving a risk issue. In other words, expense reveals efficiency. time to complete a corrective action, implement a control, or resolve an audit finding are also common KPIs. In other words, speed of closure shows control health. CRISC candidates must learn to recognize which performance metrics have risk implications. In other words, know when business data becomes risk signal. For example, a backlog in action plan completion could indicate mounting exposure. In other words, delay equals danger. The best answers use KPIs that reflect both process health and operational impact. In other words, they bridge risk and execution. KPIs support risk monitoring when selected strategically. In other words, not all KPIs are useful for risk insight. Choose KPIs for functions that support critical processes, controls, or risk-prone areas. In other words, look for high-value, high-impact operations. For example, delays in vendor onboarding might increase third-party risk. In other words, process lag may affect external exposure. Or a growing backlog in IT support might affect the speed of incident response. In other words, support delay could magnify a threat. In this way, KPIs act as indirect risk indicators. They show where performance issues might lead to elevated risk. In other words, performance gaps become warning signs. However, KPIs do not replace KRIs. They should be used in combination for a full picture. In other words, use both to understand cause and consequence. On the exam, expect to link poor performance with emerging risk, using KPI data as an early signal. In other words, diagnosis before damage. Once a KPI is selected, it must be tied to a performance threshold. In other words, raw data is meaningless without targets. This threshold helps the organization know when the metric crosses into unacceptable territory. In other words, it defines success versus failure. Use historical data, industry benchmarks, or regulatory minimums to set targets. In other words, let past and context shape expectation. Use green, yellow, and red ranges to signal performance levels and trigger escalation. In other words, use visual cues to prompt action. Always consider how KPI targets relate to risk appetite and performance expectations. In other words, risk framing makes metrics matter. KPI thresholds are not just numbers, they define when action is required. In other words, they guide response. Adjust them as business conditions, regulatory expectations, or technologies change. In other words, thresholds must evolve with context. Once KPIs are defined, they must be monitored and reported. In other words, collection is only the beginning. Use scorecards or dashboards to visualize data in a way that is useful to decision makers. In other words, design matters. KPI reports should be reviewed at both tactical and strategic levels depending on the process. In other words, fit reporting to audience. Combine KPI reports with KRIs and KCIs to create a full picture of risk, control, and performance. In other words, show how things work together. Where possible, automate data collection, but always review results for accuracy and relevance. In other words, automation must be checked. On the exam, strong answers show monitoring and reporting that supports timely, well-informed governance. In other words, metrics must lead to management. KPI design comes with challenges. In other words, not every metric is helpful. One mistake is over-relying on output metrics like number of help desk tickets without looking at outcome metrics like resolution rate. In other words, quantity isn't always quality. Another is misalignment, choosing KPIs that have no connection to business strategy or risk tolerance. In other words, measurement without purpose. Tracking too many metrics can create confusion and dilute attention. In other words, more isn't better. The biggest failure is having no owner or no escalation plan when a KPI is breached. In other words, insight without accountability. CRISC answers should reflect thoughtful, focused KPI design with clear links to business value and accountability. In other words, design with intent. KPIs are part of the broader control and risk environment. In other words, they help tell the whole story. They help interpret whether a business process is under control. In other words, performance supports stability. When paired with KRIs, they can help forecast future issues. In other words, they warn of what's coming. When paired with KCIs, they can show whether performance and control effectiveness are aligned. In other words, results match intent. KPIs also guide improvement initiatives and help prioritize staffing or technology investment. In other words, resource allocation follows insight. In CRISC scenarios, look for situations where poor performance triggers new risk assessments or leads to control redesign. In other words, performance feeds evolution. On the exam, KPIs are used to show how well something is working, not how risky it is. In other words, they evaluate performance, not exposure. If the question asks about operational performance, the correct answer will usually point to a KPI. In other words, think efficiency and output. If risk was missed, it may be because no KPI caught the performance issue. In other words, insight was lacking. When a KPI worsens, the next step is to investigate and assess whether risk has increased. In other words, evaluate impact. The best answers connect performance to governance through insight, action, and accountability. In other words, KPIs should lead to decisions that matter. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal CyberSeers RISC Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com